Hello, everyone. A very good afternoon. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. My name is Aparna Haldar, and I'll be hosting this webinar. Before we get started, please let me take a few minutes to introduce Payatu. Payatu is a research powered cybersecurity consulting firm. We have a decade long track record with a singular focus on cybersecurity. The foundation of Payatu rests upon three pillars: community and conferences, consulting and training, products. Community and conferences encompass NULCON, an international security conference, training, and exhibition platform, and Hardware.io, a hardware security focused conference, along with other initiatives. Consulting and training focuses on thorough security assessments, which helps businesses to discover security threats and further provide training to strengthen network infrastructure. Lastly, we have four offerings: IoT Auditor, an IoT security testing and compliance platform. Exploity, an open source IoT security testing framework. Exploity Academy, a comprehensive online learning platform that empowers professionals with the knowledge and skills to excel in the field of cybersecurity, particularly in the context of securing IoT devices. CloudFirst, an automated and highly scalable first testing platform. Here is an overview of the various consulting assessments we are known for across the globe. Payatu has delivered many cyber talks and workshops in top security conferences that also include Black Hat and DEF CON. We take pride in the decade-long impact we have created by contributing to the cybersecurity community all around the world. As part of our ongoing commitment to fostering knowledge sharing and collaboration in the cybersecurity realm, Payatu has launched an exciting initiative, the Payatu WhatsApp community. The community aims to educate various organizations with industry specific cybersecurity content. That was all about Payatu. Today, Anshul Mehta, Payatu's security consultant, will deliver a webinar on attacking AWS Cognito. You can read all about him on this slide. Before I hand it over to Anshul, I request you all to follow a few housekeeping tips. Please be on mute. If you have a question, you can write it in the chat box. We'll answer this at the end of the webinar. We will be releasing the recording of this webinar on our digital channels. So make sure you are following Payatu. If you're not currently following Payatu, please check the links provided in the chat box to find Payatu's digital channels. Without further ado, let's get started. Anshul, over to you.
Thank you, Aparna. So, hello everyone. Welcome to today's session. I'm Anshul Mehta, and today we'll be talking about how we can, test the security issues around AWS Cognito. So, it is a AWS service that does not get that much attention, but today we are going to focus solely on that. So, I'm going to just share my screen, and we can get started. All right. So, now, when we talk about Cognito, let's first go over today's agenda. Okay, so first we'll have an introduction and I'll be telling you what you are going to take away from today's session. We are going to briefly talk about what is Cognito. Cognito heavily depends on the OAuth 2 framework as well as OIDC, which is OpenID Connect. We'll also be discussing that briefly. Then we'll start with talking about how we can enumerate the presence of AWS Cognito within a web or a mobile application. Then we'll see how we can exploit Cognito user pools, followed by identity pool exploitation. And finally, we'll talk about how we can secure our AWS Cognito instances. So for today's session, we are going to look at how authentication and authorization works in Cognito. We're going to look at a scenario and a practical scenario, how we can exploit that. And based on that, we'll also learn how exploiting Cognito might give us access to other resources within the AWS account. And at the end, we'll of course talk about mitigating these issues as well. So let's first start by talking about what is AWS Cognito. So it is an identity management service that AWS provides, and it is basically used to add authentication and authorization features to your web and mobile applications. Now, although you can do this separately, you can create a separate backend and you can maintain your own user databases, but that tends to add a lot of overhead. And if you use Cognito, it can reduce all that overhead. You don't need to maintain separate databases. You don't need to separately code the backend for integrating user login and access control within the application. Cognito can manage that for you. And this is also very useful when you have external users that you want within your application, and you then grant them access to your AWS resources. Maybe you need to grant them access to an S3 bucket or a DynamoDB table or an API that you have within your API gateway. So Cognito can be used for all of that. Before we move forward, let's talk about some important terminology here. So the first thing we need to know is IAM in AWS. We have a service called IAM, which is at the core of all AWS services. It controls identity and access management, what level of access any user would have to the resources and assets within your environment is governed by IAM. Next, we have policies. So what is a policy? An IAM policy is a set of permissions that you assign to an IAM user, an IAM group, or an IAM role. So users and groups are, when you want to assign permissions to someone within your account. But what if I need to assign a permission to someone who's not present in my account? Let's say I have someone in a different account and I want to give him access to a resource. Then I can use what is known as an IAM role. Another use of an IAM role is when I need to give access to an AWS service to another AWS service within that account, I can set up a role and assign the appropriate policies to that. Now, when we talk about exploiting Cognito, we'll come across some tokens which are used by the OAuth 2 and the OIDC framework. And these tokens contain some attributes. These attributes are set by your Cognito user pools, and this will have some information related to your users. Imagine a web application. What kind of information does that application store about a user? It will have your username, your email ID. It may contain your full name. It may contain your address, your phone number. So all of that is what will be referred to as user attributes. Then you have scopes, and we'll talk about this further as well. So a scope is simply an identifier which is used to define the type of access that an application wants. So it could be read access, it could be write access, or it could be a combination of both. We'll also be looking at what are claims. So a claim is simply a key value pair containing some information related to your user within your application. When we look at the practical part, this will become clearer. Now, coming to the two main service offerings within Cognito. So the first offering is a user pool. And you can think of a user pool as a user database or a user directory that you can use for enabling authentication within your web or your mobile applications. So let's say I have a web application and I want to set up authentication. I can set up a user pool within Cognito, which is going to act as my identity provider. And within a user pool, you can also allow users to have federated logins through a third party like Google or Facebook or Amazon or Apple, like we have seen in a lot of applications. And you can also allow users to sign in through these rather than setting up a separate set of credentials for your user pool. The next major feature offering that Cognito has is an identity pool. So what is an identity pool? It allows a developer to grant a user access to AWS resources. So upon authentication, you log into a web application. And for example, the web application may allow you to access a set of APIs. It may allow you to access an S3 bucket. It may allow you to upload something, upload a file, upload an image, or download some data. Or it may allow you to retrieve some information from a database. So again, for all of these use cases, you might want to use Cognito identity pools. And within identity pools, you can authenticate to that using multiple types of identity providers, including user pools that we talked about previously, or via some federated sign-in options like Google, Amazon, Facebook again. So these are identity pools. Now let's also briefly discuss what are OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. So OAuth 2 is an authorization framework which allows an application to access a resource on the user's behalf without the user having to give their credentials to that application. Okay, so what happens is, let's say that there is a website which you will use to edit a photo within your Instagram account, for example. Then what the application will do is that application will tell you to log into Instagram. Instagram will send a token after you have logged in, and then the application will use this particular token to request those required photos on your behalf. In this entire process, what happens is you have not revealed your credentials to this application, which is the most important thing, right? A credential, username or password, a set of credentials, it's treated like a secret, and you don't want it to be revealed to every application that wants it. That's why we have all these federated sign-in options. A lot of applications allow you to sign in with a different identity provider, because then they don't have to manage passwords, and as a user, you don't have to worry about your passwords, about your credentials getting leaked by that application. So this framework, this results in the generation of an access token. So once you have logged in, your identity provider will issue an access token, and this access token will be then used by this application to request whatever resource it wants. And of course, while logging in, you'll have the option to, to check what access it requires, which is basically a scope. There are multiple types of flows when we talk about OAuth. There is an authorization code flow, whereas you log into an identity provider, it sends a code to your client, to your application which requires access. That client will use this code to request an access token from the authorization server, and it will use this access token to access the resource. This is when a third party client wants to access your resources. You are the resource owner. You have some, again, coming to the previous example that we used with Instagram, you have some resources, you have some photos, and you want to allow this third party application to allow those resources. So in that case, we'll be using the authorization code flow. There's a client credentials flow as well, which is used when the application wants to protect access to its own resources. Then you have a resource owner password flow where you will not require an login to an identity provider. You will not be redirected there. What will happen is you'll simply send your credentials through this application. And the last one, which is known as an implicit flow, wherein there is no authorization code, but there is directly an access token that is generated. So this implicit flow might be useful in some cases, but it can also be less secure than other methods. And this is something we are going to see during this session. Another framework that I want to mention here is OIDC, or OpenID Connect. Now this is built upon OAuth 2. So OAuth 2 is the basis for this. And this adds authentication as well to OAuth, to this token system that we're talking about. Because with OAuth, you have an access token, but it does not contain any information about you as a user or whether you are logged in. It just contains information that, okay, this is what I'm allowed to access, and it will just send that to the resource servers. But with OpenID Connect, it will generate a separate token, which is known as an ID token. And you can think about it more like, an ID card or a badge, which contains information. Typically, if you see a badge or an ID card, it will have your name, it may have your designation, it will have your photo. So depending on the use case, it will have some information about the user, and that information will be stored in the token. So now a couple of examples where we commonly see this situation happening. Let's say I want to sign into Quora, and I'm signing in through Google, signing in with Google here. So Google is telling me that, you know, it is going to share my name, email address, and language preference and profile picture with Quora. So these are the scopes that is telling me about. Now OAuth 2 is being used here. I'm signing into Quora through Google. I don't have to share my credentials with Quora in this case. Similarly, if I want to log into Spotify, I can log in via Google, Facebook, Apple, or I can continue with a phone number. So in these cases where I'm logging through Google or Facebook, I will log in to Facebook, but my credentials will not be shown to Spotify. I will not be sharing my Facebook credentials with Spotify. I'll log into Facebook and it'll then send the token to Spotify and I'll be able to use the service. So as a user, this is more secure for me. And as the application, as Spotify, they don't have to worry about managing my credentials. So you can basically say that it's a win-win situation for everyone. And we use these frameworks a lot when we log into one application through another application. And this is something that we come across on a daily basis. So behind the scenes, this is what's happening. Now, before we move forward and I show you how we are going to exploit the Cognito application, it is worth keeping in mind that whenever we are dealing with security issues within a cloud environment, whether that's AWS, whether that's Azure, GCP, or any other provider that you may use, most security issues within a cloud environment, they arise from misconfigurations rather than from software vulnerabilities. Okay, so misconfiguration is the keyword here. For example, let's say you have created a user in AWS, okay, and I've created a set of credentials for that user so that they can access my resources within this account. But by mistake, or maybe I didn't pay attention and I exposed those credentials via the source code of the application. I hard coded these credentials with the application, and anyone can just view the source code of the application. Then that becomes a security issue. But there's no software vulnerability here, or there is not a vulnerability that's present within the AWS service. But this security issue is created because of a mistake on the user's end. Similarly, any or most security issues, I would say, that you'll see within a cloud provider's environment would be due to a misconfiguration, some mistake on the end user's part. And within the user pools and the identity pools within Cognito that we're going to see, this is going to be the case. So let's take a look. A couple of things that we need to talk about security within Cognito is one of the security issues is self-service sign-up. By default, when you're creating a user pool, it allows you the option of allowing anyone to sign up to your application. Rather than you dictating a fixed set of users, just anyone can sign up. And this is something that a lot of developers miss and they just keep it enabled, even though they don't intend to allow sign up to just anyone. Where can this become a problem? Let's say you have an application where you are allowing access only to users who have paid for a particular product or a service, and then they can go on and uh, you know, log in with a set of credentials that you have provided. But if you allow self-service sign up, anyone can just sign up and access the resource even without paying for it. So this can be an issue there. Then there is a possibility for user enumeration if you don't enable a particular setting there. And this is something we are going to see as well. Lack of a client secret. Now, what happens is when you're setting up an application with Cognito, then each application has a client secret. This is passed during the authentication phase when we are talking about OAuth 2 and OIDC. Now, you can choose to disable this, and this should also allow exploitation, which is something we are going to see here. Then browser control bypass using CLI. Now, this is an important thing to note. And when you are having an application using Cognito, you have the sign up page. You might have certain security controls that you've implemented on the client side. Let's say you don't want to allow anyone to sign up. You have restricted that only users with a particular address from a specific domain, from your own organization's domain, only they can sign up. And you have kept that control within the script of your application within the client side. If I'm able to sign up to your application, if you have self-service sign up enabled, then I can simply bypass that control and log in with any random email address. Because usually when we are testing these environments, we're testing these misconfigurations, we tend to use the CLI and we use CLI tools, so that this is also an important security issue in that case. And the most, I could say, the most critical security issue that we're going to see is that you have an IAM role in an identity pool, which is over permissive. So what this means is, if I'm exploiting this and I gain access to that IAM role, as we're going to see, I will get a lot of extra permissions and I could do a lot of damage to the account. I could, exfiltrate sensitive data. I could create extra resources. I could basically have a lot of control over the environment. Now, before we move on to the exploitation, we're just going to briefly take a look at how user pool and identity pool can be integrated with each other. So I have a user pool. As a user, I'll sign into that application. That user pool, as when I've signed in, it returns the access token and ID token. And this is something that's being handled on the backend for me by the application. And then the application is going to authenticate me to the identity pool. Now, this identity pool is allowing me to access AWS resources. So when I have access to these resources, the level of access I have depends on how it has been configured. And this dictates what I can do with these resources. Now, how can you figure out whether Cognito is being used within an application or not? Right? So the first thing you need to look off is whether the application URL contains this auth.useast1.amazoncognito.com, or it could be any other region as well, US East 2, AP South 1. So AWS has a list of multiple regions that it supports. And depending on where the application has been configured, this region could be anything. So if you notice this kind of URL within the login page or the sign up page of the application, then you can be sure that Amazon Cognito is being used there. In certain cases, developers can choose to use their own domains, separate domains that they can configure. So that will not be the case. The URL will not have Amazon Cognito in it. What can we do in that case? So then we can look for what kind of scripts is the application loading. If you find something which mentions Amazon Cognito, Amazon AWS SDK, AWS Cognito, if you find any of these scripts that the application is loading, or we find mention of these scripts within the application source code, then we know that Cognito is being used here. If we are intercepting the traffic, if you're using burp suite, then I can also intercept the requests that are being made by the application. And if it is making a request to this particular host, Cognito IDP dot US East 1, or this region could be a different region as well, then that's another way for me to find out that this application is using Cognito. So there are multiple ways by which we can figure out, by which we can enumerate that Cognito is being used within a particular application that you're testing. Now, coming to the practical part. So here we have set up an application specifically for this session. And you can see that when you'll go to this application, verysecure.auth.useast1.amazoncognito.com. So this is using Amazon Cognito. And this is a sign up page, a sign in page. I can sign in with a username and password. And I also have the option to create a new account and sign up if I want. So if I go to sign up, I'll see that it requires a username, it requires an email, and it requires a password. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the CLI for this. Okay, so if there is any browser security controls, I'll bypass that. And the commands for these we have also mentioned on the slides. Okay, so you can use these as reference if you want to try along as well. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to try signing up. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that when we use the AWS CLI, this is just a typical Ubuntu instance and we have installed the AWS CLI. You can install it on any Windows or Linux instance or Mac, whatever you use. We typically require a user account in order to run AWS commands and access AWS resources. However, in this case, since with Cognito, we are signing up, I don't have a user account configured within my AWS CLI, and I don't need that as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Cognito IDP. You can have multiple AWS services. You have IAM, you have S3. So whatever the name of the service is, you'll simply use that here. So I'll use Cognito IDP. And what I'm trying to do is I'm going to sign up. So I need to sign up here. Now, one thing to keep in mind is there are certain pieces of information that we need here. So the first thing that I need is there's a client ID for every application that is there. So this client ID is required by me. I'm going to copy this. Okay. And I'm going to specify it here. Client ID. So in certain cases, if the application is not using a Cognito URL, then the client ID may be a part of that URL, or it may be embedded within the application source code or within a request or a response that we are receiving from Cognito. So those are the other alternative places where we can look for this information. So now that I'm using this client ID, I also require what region this application is in. For all AWS commands that we run, we need to specify what region we need to call the API for. So in this case, we know that the region is US East 1. So let's say in this case, region US East 1. Now I need a username because I'm signing up to this application. And we know that it requires username, email, and password. So the username I'm going to use, let's just say test user 1. Okay. And the password. Now password will have a certain password policy applied to it. And for information on what that password policy is, I can simply just start typing here. And it will show me that password must contain lowercase letter, number. It must have at least 12 characters and it must contain a special character or space. Okay, so since I know this password policy now, I can simply configure a password accordingly. All I need is lowercase, number, special character, and I need to make sure that it's 12 characters. So I can simply say, okay, so this would be my password. Again, this is not a secure password. This is just something we're creating for this session. Now we specified a region, we specified a username, we specified a password. What is left is an email. The format for specifying an email address within this command is slightly different. As you can see here, for email, we need to specify it with the user attribute switch. Okay, so just to save some time, I'm going to copy it from here. And I'm going to specify this within my command. I'm just going to, for this demonstration, I'm using a temporary email and the email ID. Now, typically, you can use this no sign request option to tell the CLI, to tell AWS that I'm not going to send this command, send this API call as an authenticated user. I'm sending this command as an unauthenticated user. But in this case, with Cognito, it won't matter because anyway, I'm signing up. So you can choose whether you want to have this or not. But with other AWS services, whether you use this or not will matter. Okay, it seems like some Okay, yeah. Mistake here. Just give me a second. Okay, yeah. So this, correct this. Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. So we have used the sign up command, and the response that we've received, it tells us that the user confirmed is false. So we have signed up, but we've yet to confirm our sign up. Okay, so it's going to send a confirmation code, and where it's going to send a destination, the email I've specified, delivery medium is email, and the name of the attribute is also email. And this is a user sub or a subject, which is a unique value that it assigns to every user. Because for any other attribute, if we are talking about, whether it's a username or a name, that could be duplicate. Two people could have the same username, could have the same name. So in order to avoid any confusion, all users are given this separate user sub. So this is a unique attribute. Now it says that it has sent a confirmation email, but we have not confirmed that yet. So since we use a temp mail, let's check. Yes, we have received a verification email. Let's check what is the code. So we've received a verification code 346560. Now to save on time, we're just going to, I'm going to copy this and paste it here. So this command is AWS Cognito IDP again, the same service. So yeah, we have already signed up and we have received our confirmation email as well. And now what we need to do is we need to confirm our sign up. So in order to do that, I need to use the Cognito IDP confirm sign up command. Again, I need to specify the region. I need to specify the client ID. So let's just take the client ID from our previous command itself. And the username was test user one. And the confirmation code that we've received. So in this case, our confirmation code is 346560. So I'm just going to add that here. Okay, so now what we're doing is we are confirming that we have signed up, and this can be done through the UI, and this can also be done for the uh, through the command line as we are doing here. Okay. No, there's no sign. Okay. There's the test user, it's saying. Okay, it's saying that client ID combination not found. Okay, yeah. Let's try this out. It's saying that the user is not found. Okay, so let's see what happens when we run this command again. User already exists, test user one. Now that is actually there, that S is there, but okay. That is not seen here. So the spelling is not the issue. It's telling me that the user is not present. Okay, what we'll do is we'll just create a new user. We'll use a separate temp mail. Okay. Just search for temp mail. This one will not generate a new one for us at this time. We need to use a separate temp mail, and we'll just create a new user, and we'll see what gives us then. So in this case, replace the email ID here. And the user will just say test A. Replace the user ID with replace the email actually, sorry. This. Okay. Okay, so we've created a new user. This time we have called it test A. Now we'll try to confirm this sign up. Let's see if should have received the mail. A32557. Okay. And the combination not found. Is there an issue with the client ID? This is the client ID that we've used in this case as well. I'll just get the client ID again from here. Yeah, you can try that. Okay, again, the same thing. Email in username rather than username. Let's try that. Okay, let's try that. Instead of going through that, we can just simply, yeah. And we'll just request a new temp mail here. This is, okay. It was configured for email alias. So yeah, this is the error we'll get. Okay, so it's giving us a bit of an error. Let's see if we can just sign up here directly. So I'll use this email, username, let's say test B, okay? And a password. Okay, so we can also, of course, sign up here. Now, in this case, there is no restriction. There is no JavaScript code that is preventing us from using any temp mail. But in a production application, that might be the case. So in that case, you'll have to resort to the CLI. Okay. So we have our, no, this is not the correct one. We have a confirmation code, and we can just confirm the account. And we've received access to the application. Now, when we talk about exploitation within the user pool, what happens is that there is a limited scope of things that you can do there. So one thing you can do is you can register as a user, even though the application use case doesn't want you to, if the user, if the admin has left the self sign up option enabled, and then you would have access to all of the application's features. So in this case, we've kept the application very simple. And what it does is it allows us to select a file and then upload that file. So in this case, an identity pool is also attached with this application. What it allows you to do is when you're authorized, when you're authenticated to this application, what it will do, it will also give you permission to upload your images to that specific S3 bucket that has been configured. Not all cases will see an identity pool integrated with a user pool, because that would depend on the specific use case for your application, whether you want this or not. But in case you do, then again, now in order to exploit the identity pool, what do I need to do? An identity pool has an ID. In a user pool, we've seen that we have a client ID. Similarly, in an identity pool, also there is an ID. So the first thing where I'm going to look at, the first place that I'm going to look at, I'm going to go and see whether this application source code tells me something. Okay, so I'm looking at the upload web page and I'm looking at the source code for this. So let's see what we can find. Okay, so this application is hard coding all of these details here, which will be the case for certain applications. In case that is not what you find within an application that you're testing, you can look for requests and responses. You can look for, let's say if it's a mobile application, because you can also use Cognito with your mobile applications. In that case, you'll have to decompile the application and maybe you'll find a identity pool ID hard coded there. So in this case, we have found that the identity pool ID is being exposed within this application. Okay. So we can now use this to see if we can authenticate to the identity pool. So far, we have authenticated to the user pool. And the level of exploitation or the kind of exploitation that a user pool allows, that is quite limited, like I mentioned. Next thing you can do in a user pool is you can enumerate the users. There's a particular setting for a user pool which prevents errors from showing up, which prevents enumeration. But if that is not enabled, then you will be able to enumerate a user. When you're signing up and you're choosing a username or an email ID, if that is already taken, it will show you that the user already exists. So now you know that, okay, a user with this particular username already exists, and you can try to brute force that account's credentials. You can try to log in as that users and get access to their data, right? But how would you go about exploiting an identity pool? So the first step is to find the identity pool ID. And in our case, we have found that within the web application itself. In case you're not dealing with a web application, you might be dealing with a mobile application, an Android application, let's say. Then you may find the identity pool within the application's code once you decompile that. Now, there are two things here within an identity pool. It also allows guest users and it allows authenticated users. So guest users have different permissions and authenticated users will have different permissions. This is by design. So now, by default, what happens is if you directly try to authenticate to a user ID, you will get permissions of the guest user. So let's see how we can do that. So in order to do that, we need to call API, which is Cognito Identity, not Cognito IDP. Last time we were dealing with Cognito IDP. Now we need to use Cognito Identity. Okay. So Cognito Identity, and we have an identity pool. So identity pool is what a pool of identity, the pool of IDs. We need to request an ID here. So get ID. Okay. And as a parameter, I need to pass the identity pool's ID. So in our case, that ID happens to be this. We have this value. Again, this will also require what region you are making this request to. And it has given you an identity ID. Okay, so from the identity pool, we need to get an identity first. Now we can request some credentials for this ID. Okay, so the next step would be to get credentials for identity. AWS Cognito Identity and get. Can anyone tell me what kind of credentials these would be? Access key, secret key. Yes, but there's also one more part to that. Not just access key and secret key, one more value there. You're right in that it would be AWS credentials. That is correct. That part is correct. But there would be one more thing apart from the access key and the secret key. So that is going to be our session token. Why we are not having just the access key and secret key, why we also have this extra value? The reason is because these are temporary credentials. As you can see, they have an expiration date attached to it. So this is in the Unix epoch time format. And if you want, you can convert that and see. So these are temporary credentials. These will expire, and these credentials, they come from a role. Like I said, in identity pools, you can have either your guest users or authenticated users. So currently we are guest users here because we are directly just getting an identity from the pool and asking AWS to give us credentials for it. So this is the access key ID, secret key. If I want to check what kind of permissions I have with these, there's a tool that I'm going to use called Enumerate IAM. Okay, and the way to do that is you set up that tool, and I'm going to use that within a virtual environment. Okay, now what we need to do is we need to specify all of these credentials. We need to specify the access key, which is this. Along with our secret key. So just for a second, I'm going to minimize this because otherwise what happens is I'm going to zoom out, sorry, because the session token it will get, the full value won't be copied. So that's why I'm just zooming out for a minute and then we'll go back again. And then we have the session token. Now what this tool is going to do, essentially it's going to try multiple API calls to AWS, okay, and tell us what works and what doesn't. Session, okay. The region is required. Token. Let me just zoom out fully. I think the access token is not being properly copied. Okay. Secret key is there. Session token. Okay. My bad. I made a mistake with the spellings here. Okay. Sorry about that. Mistyped the session token spelling. So what we have done is we have provided the access key, we have provided the secret key and the session token. And what is it doing? It's starting the permission enumeration for this particular set of credentials. As you can see, this is the account ARN. So ARN is the Amazon resource name. Each resource has an individual name. And you can see this is an assumed role. So I mentioned IAM roles. Whenever you want to have temporary credentials, it's best to use IAM roles, and those credentials would then expire after a set period of time. So in this case, they would expire in 1 hour because that's what we've set within the identity pool. And the role here is named Cognito unauth role. This is basically the guest role or the unauthenticated role. So this role will not have the level of permission that the authenticated role will have. But still, it was able to run 3 commands: get caller identity, DynamoDB describe endpoints, and S3 list buckets. It was able to run these 3 commands. So I'm stopping this because it can run for a long time. And typically, all the results that it gets, it will initially be able to show you all the successful API calls. And based on that, then you can figure out, okay, these are the resources that I can access. And this is the information that I can retrieve using this access. Now the command for accessing an S3 bucket, or command for listing all the S3 buckets, actually, in this case, would be AWS S3 ls. This would list all the buckets within the account. Now, we're running a little short on time, so I'm not showing that here. But And this is what you will do in order to run that command. Now this is, keep in mind, unauthenticated access that we have exploited with identity pools. Our main goal is to try to get authenticated access. So what am I going to do now? I created an account within the user pool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use that account's credentials to prove to identity pool that I am authenticated. And it is going to give me a set of credentials which will have more permissions compared to what I just had. Okay. So for that, again, I need to go back to the previous API that I was using. Actually, we can let this be. So AWS Cognito IDP, the first type. This is the identity provider API that we used. And we need to run the command initiate auth. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to save on time. We're just going to copy paste the values here. Okay, so client ID again. Client ID is the value that we used previously, which was this. Now, another parameter that I've specified is the auth flow, which is the user password authentication. There are multiple types of authentication flows, but here we can see that if you try to sign into this application, okay, if I go back to the sign in page. Now, since I recently signed in as test B, okay, if I want to sign in as a different user, all it requires is the username and the password. Nothing else is required if I want to sign in. So the authentication flow, in most of the cases that you'll see, if this is an exploitation that you're working on, that will be user password authentication. And now we need to specify the parameters. Username was test B. I'm just going to change that. Yeah. Password. Did I mention this is not secure? So yeah. So now what has happened is that I have authenticated to the user pool and I have gotten a set of tokens. This is the access token, refresh token, and an ID token. Now these are basically all just your JWT, JSON web tokens. If you want, we can just, take one of these tokens. So I'm going to take the ID token here. Okay. Take this token, take this value. I'm going to go to jwt.io and sorry, that did not get copied, I guess. And I'm going to paste that token value here. So in the header is simply, it's telling you the key ID that was used to sign this and what algorithm is being used. But the main data is within the payload. So it's saying that this is the user sub for which this token has been issued. Email verified, it shows as true because we did that earlier. And the issuer of the token, so Cognito IDP, this is the token issuer, and this is your user pool ID, not the client ID, the user pool ID. And Cognito has set this attribute username as the name of the username, along with some other information like the token use is an ID token, what is the authentication time, what is the expiry time, issue time, and the email associated. So all of this information is exactly why ID tokens were introduced. So your access token, if you try the same thing, it will not have this level of information. So since we, are running a bit low, I'm not going to get into the access token here. Now what we need to do is authenticate to the ID pool. Again, I'm going to just copy paste here since To save time, I am going to use this command now. Why I require this token is because I have to prove to the identity pool that I'm authenticated. Otherwise, it has no way to know whether I'm authenticated or not, right? So I need to specify a separate parameter here known as logins. And the command that I'm using is cognito identity get ID, similar to what we used previously, get ID. But now we are also providing proof that, okay, I'm logged in. Okay, so you give me an ID and then you give me the credentials for that ID. So identity pool ID is what we are using here to get an ID. Token issuer is what I need to add here. Since identity pool, like I said, supports federated logins as well. So we have multiple types of issuers. In this case, like I mentioned, Cognito as our issuer. We don't need the HTTP part. I'm just going to copy this and paste it here. Now what I need is the value of the ID token itself. So the token that has been generated here. Okay, we can just let's go. Something. Use this login that says just give me a moment. Yeah, sorry guys, just 1 second. We'll continue. Just quickly- Okay. Found the mistake again. With this with token, it gets a little this thing. There's a lot of okay. Just give me a second, guys. I'll just confirm the previous commands that we've run. Just bear with me for a moment. Check this and we'll, yeah. This should be the correct one. Got the wrong ASCII code. That could be, let me check. That is a possibility. Yeah. Yeah, you are right. Yeah. That's what happens when you copy paste from multiple sources multiple times. Yes. Sorry about that. Okay. So what we've done is we have used our user pool ID, the ID token that we received actually, not the user pool ID. And we are telling the identity pool that, okay, I am logged in, I'm an authenticated user. Now give me an ID. And now using this ID, I need to tell the ID pool that now you give me credentials for the authenticated role. So in this case, again, we are going to use the same command as we used previously. This time, we'll get a separate set of credentials, okay? So get credentials for identity. And we don't need the identity pool ID, we need the identity ID. This command is very much similar to what we ran previously, with just one difference that we've also added the logins here. So this was the identity pool. I'm going to just remove this. Okay, so this is the ID that we have received. It has created for us. And the rest would be the same. Okay. So we've received a different set of credentials now. Again, we have an access key, we have a secret key, and we have a session token. Okay. So let's try enumerating now. What is the scenario? Okay. Our access key is going to be this one. Okay, so while I type this out, I have a question for you guys. When you look at an access key, okay, so just like what we have here, can you tell whether it's for a temporary credential or for a permanent or long-lasting credential just by looking at the access key? Is there a way to tell just from the access key? Yes, okay, that's correct. There is a way to tell. Do you know what it is? Yes, IA and AKIA. Yes. So what happens is for you can just look at an access key, and if it starts with ASIA, that's going to be a temporary credential, which is usually assigned through an IAM role. And if you get AKIA, that's a permanent credential, and it would have been assigned to a user. Okay, so now we've started enumerating permissions for this access key ID. And you can see that the role we have received is a different one. Previously, we had the unauthenticated role, and now we have a Cognito IDP role. It's the same account, same identity pool, but now we've just logged in as, now we've just gotten an ID as a logged in user, as an authenticated user. So this identity pool is integrated with the user pool. We have logged in with the user pool, proved our identity to the identity pool, and we have gotten these credentials. If you notice now, this list of permissions is much longer than previous. Again, I'm going to stop this here because it can run for a lot of time. Now, if I want to use these credentials, I'm just going to configure a new profile. I'll paste the access key first. Okay, from what you can see on the screen, can you tell me what kind of access we can expect here? I know I'm scrolling up and down a bit, but based on the permissions that we can see now, is the level of access the same? Has it changed? If it has changed, then what has changed? You know, session token you have to configure separately, by the way. Okay, so AWS configure set AWS session token, and then you provide the value. Also, whenever you're configuring a profile that's not default, remember that you always need the profile flag. Now I'm trying to get my identity here. Let's see what I can figure out with this set of credentials. Okay, so we have properly configured this set of credentials. More access than previous one, read or write. Okay, so depending on the credentials you get, you may have write permissions as well. But in this case, I have only given read permissions for this particular role, but read permissions for the SSM resource. So SSM is systems manager. And if you see that you have permissions to retrieve data from SSM, there is a parameter store which can store sensitive data. So if you can retrieve the values, if you can retrieve the data from parameter store, you might be able to exfiltrate some sensitive information. So let's try that. Okay. Maybe since we already have our profile configured, so why not? AWS SSM, and the parameter store stores parameters. So AWS SSM, I'm going to say get, or rather, first I'll say describe. Will describe all the parameters. Profile is this new profile that I've created. Okay, so it says that there is one parameter. The type is secure string, so it is storing this parameter as an encrypted string. The name of the parameter itself is key. It's stored as a secure string, so it is encrypted when AWS is storing it. But it hasn't shown this value here. Okay, so a different command is required. Also keep in mind, I have already set the default region while configuring this profile. Otherwise, I would have to specify the region here as well. That's why it didn't ask me for it. Otherwise, it would have said that no region is specified. So now just quickly try to get this parameter. So get, we need the parameter name. So the name of the parameter is simply key. And I need to specify the profile. You new. Okay, so we have retrieved the parameter. So, but is this the proper value? Or do we need to do something else here? Would anyone like to venture a guess? Decrypt. Yes. Since it's a secure string, it needs to be decrypted. But we don't have to do much. All we need to do is get parameter, and I can simply specify a switch that's called with decryption. Okay. So with decryption, and we have received our sensitive data. Again, this is just as we have configured one parameter and we can store that in parameter store. But if you actually get this kind of access through an identity pool, you were able to exploit that, you may also have access to multiple resources. The reason why this can be so critical is because often in development environments, what happens is that I've created one role and I reuse that role for multiple services. So if I had reused that kind of role which gives a user a lot of access to the account, and I had just set that role as the Cognito authenticated role as well, then I would have had a lot of control over this account. I would have been able to, you know, put some malicious data. I would have been able to upload malware. I would have been able to extract all sensitive information from S3, from APIs, from lambdas, API keys. Maybe some credentials are stored. Maybe sensitive customer data is stored within this kind of environment. So that is why whenever we are pen testing or going through a Cognito environment, this becomes a very serious security issue. Okay. Now, before we end the session, let's briefly talk about securing our Cognito instances. And I think it might be better if we look at this from a practical standpoint. Okay. Just we have our account here that we used to set it up. Now, AWS by default, it will offer you a lot of different ways to manage the security, to properly configure it. But if you don't use that, then it can be vulnerable. Let's say if I create a new user pool here, okay, I can also allow users to sign in through Google, Apple, Facebook. I can say that I would only allow users to sign in through that. Again, for now, let's skip that. User pool options, we'll just say username and email, and we're not allowing any of these options. Then again, of course, you can set the password policy, but when it comes to exploitation, of course, if I can see the screen, if I can see the password policy, that's not really adding security to my exploitation process if I'm able to create a separate user. But if we want to brute force, then again, to prevent brute force information, of course, I would recommend that you use a custom password and set a minimum length to at least 14 characters, because 8 is very less nowadays. Again, our application did not have MFA. So MFA is an additional security measure that you can add to protect your applications. You can use authenticator apps, Auth, SMS messages. So it gives multiple options. Okay. For this case, just we're going to go ahead and this is a critical thing which I mentioned, self-service sign-up. It's enabled by default, and developers often, if they don't pay attention to this, then they can cause a security issue by allowing anyone to sign up, even though that may not be the intended usage. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind is that you have custom attributes. Okay. As a developer, you make sure that you don't make any custom attributes like, attributes with set access level of a user. Normal user will have reader access level and you have an admin access level. If you allow a user to to change the attribute, there are writable attributes as well. If you allow users to change their attributes and they are able to simply change their access level from reader to admin, then that's another issue. This is just the message delivery. There's no issue here. And then simply you can come over and just configure your Cognito user pool application clients. Okay, another very important thing is IAM roles. So just I'm going to quickly go to IAM and show you the role that was being used here. Yeah, leave page. So whenever you are creating a role for any purpose, make sure that you always follow the principle of least privilege. Again, yeah, you don't have MFA enabled here, but this is a setup. This is a lab account only. So we have this unauthenticated role and the IDP role. I'm going to show you the permissions that were attached here. There's SSM read-only access. And there was another permission, another policy here, which was related to S3. But typically, you should not be using star in most places, okay? For example, if I want to allow users to upload objects to an S3 bucket. So yeah, I can give them the put object permission. But in this case, that is not the only thing that I'll be able to do. So would anyone like to venture a guess as to what is the issue here? Is there an issue here, first of all, according to you? And if so, is that allowing more access to the user than required? This policy, other than allowing SSM read-only access, it needs to allow users to upload upload objects to an S3 bucket. So other than that, is there anything else that can be done here? Is there any excessive privilege or over permissive policy that has been granted here? Yes, with put matter. Okay. Uh, how? How is that over permissive? I want to use the put object now. Upload file is the that is a required permission. I need to have users being able to upload objects to my S3 bucket. But is there anything else that they can change here other than just objects uploading to an S3 bucket? List is fine. List is fine. Again, list all objects depending on your use case. If you are hosting sensitive information, that would be an issue. And in this case, okay, so one person said that we haven't specified a resource. Okay, that is a very critical thing. We shouldn't use just star here. You should specify the particular bucket. Otherwise, you'll be able to just upload stuff to any bucket that you want within the account. That's not secure. Update any, yes, exactly. That's the point. You should have specified resource. That's a very critical security issue here. You should not generalize these policies. You should drill down to the specifics. You should specify the resource, particular bucket, and anything else. Okay, so with put, you also have a put bucket policy option. So you can change the access policy for the bucket, not just a single resource, but for any bucket within the account. So policies like these are very bad. They are not secure at all, which is the point that we're trying to make here. And typically, you see that within these cloud environments, you exploit one service and through that you exploit misconfigurations or security issues in other services. Okay, so with that, we've come to the end of the session. Does anyone have any questions? Cloud pen testing after web pen is okay. Yeah, so this Cognito is something we wanted to focus on and bring to you in this session because it's kind of an intersection between cloud as well as web. So Cognito is definitely something you would see associated with a web or a mobile application, but it can also have serious implications for your cloud environment, like we've seen here. PPT after the session, yeah, after the session, there's also a recording. We'll be uploading that as well, and you'll get the resources. Don't worry. Any other questions from anyone? Resource to learn cloud pen testing in a structured way. Okay. So I'll say that if you want to get started in cloud pen testing with labs, okay, yeah. So there are a couple of things. First, you learn everything you can about what cloud provider you want to start with. Okay. So for example, if you're talking about AWS, like in this case, get started with what are the common AWS services? How can that be exploited? How can that be secured? Okay, start with the most common services, S3, Lambda, EC2, RDS, and then move on to other services. And make sure you go through the official documentation as well, because that really has a lot of good explanations on how each and every feature works, how you can secure it. They'll also warn you of vulnerabilities and stuff. is OAuth to secure? Like if one data or user credentials are compromised, no. See, the thing with OAuth 2 is it is not leaking your credentials, right? If I'm using Facebook to log into my Spotify account, my Facebook credentials are not being leaked to Spotify. Okay, OAuth 2, that's where it comes into play. So Spotify only has access to the token, and there is a refresh token. So it keeps asking for a new access token or an ID token, whatever it is using. So with OAuth 2, that is security is one of the major problems that OAuth 2 solves. Even if an application might accidentally end up leaking your token, it cannot leak your credentials via OAuth 2, because OAuth 2, the whole purpose is that you don't have to share your credentials to multiple places with multiple applications. So yes, OAuth 2 definitely addresses your concern, Mayur. Coming back to the cloud thing, again, I would say that, if you want to get started with cloud pen testing, you can set up your own accounts, and there is a resource called Cloud Goat. Okay. Specifically for AWS, you can set that up in your account, try to attempt to hack it. You can find it on GitHub, it's open source, and then learn through that. It's always best to, set up these resources in your own personal accounts. Certifications. Okay. Coming to certifications, is AZ500 certification worth doing? See, AZ500, again, if that's something that you feel will, from a skill point of view, you can do without a certification as well. But from a job point of view, certifications can be really helpful. AZ500, I would say, yeah, it's a really good certification. But again, make sure that, you don't just attempt the certification for the sake of it. You pick up the skills that that it requires, and then you go for it. And in general, certifications can be good, but make sure that you're not giving it just for the sake of adding it on your resume. It will definitely enhance. And AWS, I would say, has a good, even beginner level certification if you want to get started with it. Then that would also be good. Okay. If you're saying that the Facebook account is compromised, then other applications which are connected with that Facebook. So via OAuth in that case. See, when let's say your Facebook account is compromised, okay, then your credentials, again, that is your biggest concern. With OAuth, what happens is, again, I'm coming back to the Spotify example. If you've logged into Spotify using Facebook, Facebook will send the token to Spotify, and Spotify has to manage that token. Okay, Facebook is not going to manage that token. It's saying, I have given it to you, you manage it. You want to access the resource on this user's behalf, that's fine, but I'm not going to manage the token. So Facebook does not have that token anymore. Whenever Spotify wants access, it will use that token. And there is a refresh token as well, which they can use to get a new access token and a new ID token periodically. In general, how much time it takes to get good knowledge. Okay. See, again, that depends. Okay. Cloud pen test. If you are going at it for, let's say, 8 hours a day, every day, within 1 month, you can get a lot of, hands-on stuff, and you would have a good knowledge base. But again, that's not a generalized question. I mean, it would depend on you. But if you want to get started, definitely look into CloudGo and set up an AWS account. It has a free tier, so you can do a lot of stuff there. A lot of resources will be available to you for free. For 1 year, you can use the free tier. Even GCP, they offer something like $300 or something for the first 3 months. So you can use that. And just, initially just experiment with these services, both via the console as well as within the CLI, because that will give you some good practice on how these things are done. Mayur, regarding hiring, I would say that you follow us on our social channels, and whenever there are new roles that we're hiring for, we definitely mention that on our LinkedIn profile as well. So you can, yeah. look forward to any vacancies or any information about hiring from there. Is industry adopting OCI cloud? Yes, gradually it is happening, but yeah. Initially, everyone went towards AWS, then Azure and GCP came up, and then OCI also. I mean, it does not have that much market share as the major, you know, major providers like Azure or AWS, but definitely it's growing. Yeah, in the past year or two, I would say it has made definitely an impact.
Also, regarding the hiring question, Mayur, you can email sneha@payatu.io for any hiring related queries. I am dropping the email in the chat box. Okay, that is it for now. Thank you so much, everyone, for being such wonderful participants. And Anshul, thank you once again for delivering such an amazing session. I request you all to follow and subscribe to all the social channels so that you can uh, be aware of more such future sessions from us. Till then, everyone have a great day and also have a great weekend ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you guys for joining.